past, this session will be recorded. I'm Maggie Brooks. I'm past SIOP historian. I want to thank you for attending the 2021 SIOP Living History Series, where we were lucky to have with us Dr. Neal Schmitt. Since being honored with this award, Neal's wife, Kara, tells me that he refers to himself now as a living artifact. So you're welcome for that. The format of this session will be first an interview with Neal, and then we'll have an opportunity at the end, the last probably 10 to 15 minutes to ask questions. You're welcome to use the chat feature at any time to submit questions during the interview, and we will address those during the question and answer period. During the question and answer period, you're also welcome to use the hand raise function to ask questions. And then finally, before we get started, I want to thank Lauren Moran, who is our Zoom facilitator, who is providing us with great support and will also be facilitating the question and answer period. So with that, we will get started. All right, so thank you again, Neal, for being here and for being willing to share your experiences and insights. Let's start at the beginning in your life in Iowa, growing up on a dairy farm, I understand. Can you talk a little bit about your early life and what aspects of your experiences in those early years have affected your life and career?
Well, before I begin with that, I'd like to thank you for putting this together, Maggie, and also all the other people who were involved. And of course, I want to thank my colleagues, grad students, faculty members, and my wife, and lots of other people who have made a very satisfying career for me. The only regret I have is that I couldn't start over. But starting with your question, I suspect this is the only time that a slide in a SIOP presentation featured cows and corn. But I did grow up on a dairy farm in Iowa. I think I was lucky enough also to spend my first 12 years of education at a parochial school. There were no public schools in my hometown, and the ones in the neighboring towns are really awful. So in this particular case, the nuns provided an excellent education. I did also have, I graduated high school with 14 students, and of those 14, only one was not with me in first grade. So it was a very stable town. So usual farming community. Certainly didn't have a lot of outside experiences. We never went beyond Iowa, Wisconsin, and Minnesota, which are only about 50 miles away. So that was pretty much my first 18 years.
Great. Well, I will say that I'm from Wisconsin and my uncle was a dairy farmer, so I was thrilled at the opportunity to use this slide. Moving on to your college years, you started in clinical psychology, and you told me kind of a little bit about how you backed into IO, I think you said by default. What are some of the experiences that led you somewhat backwards into IO?
Well, I went to a small liberal arts school in Dubuque, Iowa, Loras College, and the only thing that psychology majors thought of there was clinical psychology. We just didn't have much exposure to other areas. And so that's what first attracted me to psychology. But I spent 1 year serving as a big brother to a really sweet little kid who was about 7 or 8 years old. And we went out every week, had a reasonable time, but every once in a while he'd get a temper tantrum and he would use every version of foul language you can imagine. He'd kick and scream, and I decided that I wasn't going to be able to deal with that sort of behavior. So I looked for another applied field, and the only one that my undergraduate professors knew of was IO psychology. So that's what I decided to go to graduate school in. And I had one good advisor who at that time told me that the three best programs were Purdue, Ohio State, and Iowa State. So I applied to those three and ended up going to Purdue. And that's how I became an IO psychologist.
So we will move on to that experience, your graduate school experience. So I think it's pretty common. Most people pack a lot into the graduate school years. But in addition to all of the graduate school things, you also got married and spent 2 years, I believe, in the Army. And I think maybe you still finished graduate school in about 5 years. So tell us a little bit about that and how you managed that.
Well, there's nothing like the prospect of a draft notice to make you hurry. So I went to graduate school, with a 1-year graduate school deferment. And I did my best to finish my master's thesis. I actually finished it my second year. I got an additional year's deferment from my draft board. And then again, I was doing everything I could to finish what I had time to do so. And I finished my prelims or comprehensive exams at the end of my second year. I took them with Frank Schmitt and Brad, I've forgotten Brad's last name, Bob Meekum is another name, and six of the rest of us, and I passed. But at the end of that second year, I also finally ended out of luck with my draft board, and they decided that I had to go. And at that point in time, I was 25 and a half, 26, I believe at that point in time was the magical age after which you didn't get drafted anymore. So I just barely missed. But I spent 2 years in the Army, and then I came back the last year at Purdue and finished my dissertation. So I was in graduate school just 3 years. At the end of my first year, Cara and I got married. She stayed at Purdue while I went to the Army at least the first year. And then we finished together after a year, in the year after I got back from the Army. So it was kind of I wouldn't advise that schedule for any graduate student, but it was definitely dictated by external circumstances. And it worked out okay.
So then your first academic position at Northern Kentucky University. You weren't there for very long, but maybe briefly tell us about that experience.
Well, I applied to several practitioner jobs. I remember the CIA and General Motors, and also to a variety of academic institutions. The only one we would consider a tier 1 university, I think, was Penn State. That was the only job that year. And I believe I lost that position to Jim Farr. Then I decided to go to Northern Kentucky State College at that time. It was not a good experience. And, it was a 4-course teaching load, which wasn't terrible, but our chair just didn't have any sense of what an academic institution was like, and he was supported wholeheartedly by the provost. And so after a year, I decided that if I couldn't get a better job, I'd do something else. So I applied to Ohio State and Michigan State and to various medical schools. Fortunately, I got an interview at Ohio State and Michigan State that year, and Michigan State made me an offer. I like to think it was largely due to Frank Schmitt, who was a faculty member there at that time. And he and I also went to graduate school together, and we took our prelims together. So we knew each other quite well. Unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, Frank left after the first year. No, before I came to Michigan State. He left about a month before I came. So I met great colleagues at Northern Kentucky, but the position was not an academic position. So I was glad to leave. My next academic experience, and the only one I've had the rest of my career, was at Michigan State University. This is the psychology building now. It was actually renovated for us in 2003 and 4. It used to be a physics building. The renovation looked great to us at that time because there were 4 or 5 places where psychology was housed at that point. So having a single building for all of us, except for the neuroscience people, was really a great luxury. The building had a number of problems. They did not totally renovate it. It had been uninhabited, I think, for 2 or 3 years. So, and the water system wasn't fixed right. So the first year we must have had at least a dozen floods. It was really a mess. The worst one, I think, occurred New Year's Eve one year. A pipe burst in our clinic, and there was about a foot of water in it when it was discovered. And if you've ever handled wallboard or plasterboard that has had water in it, you know what a disaster that was. But I spent the last 6 or 7 years of my psychology career in that building, and then several years of my retirement there as well.
Great. So I want to take us now through some of that long career at Michigan State, starting with a little bit about your research. And let's start with talking a little bit about the evolution of your research interests through the years.
Well, I did a dissertation on decision-making research, decision-making topic. It was something we called the Brunswick lens model at that time. It was a lab research study and was looking at various aspects of a task as they influenced the way people used information. I continued some of that research at Michigan State for a number of years, and my first publications, maybe 8 or 10 of them, involve that basic lab research. It wasn't very familiar to most IO people, but it did serve me well in the sense that my research was under my own control, insofar as I could get undergrads to sign up, which wasn't hard. But I then decided to, it was always my objective to apply this in the real world. So I did an early study on decision-making in the interview, basically using real world data, but a decision-making model of it. Also did a lit review that first year of the literature on interviewing. It was, again, I think we talked about what might be useful to new academics. I think that particular strategy, doing studies that are under your control rather than getting data from an applied situation where you're not in control typically, was a good one because it meant that I got an early start on publication and published research. I was also helped a whole lot by Purdue alum along the way. I think graduate students, Michigan State graduate students have helped each other as well. The sorts of networking you do both in and out of graduate school really can be helpful. And I can think of the things that Tom Jeswald, Rich Klimowski, Frank Schmitt, and others that were Purdue alumni with me, things that they gave me access to that I otherwise would not have. I think since then, my research has been primarily applied, not laboratory research. There's probably a lot of it was dictated by um, various applied projects that I got to help support graduate students. I never took an applied project that didn't have at least one of two uh, characteristics. One was that I thought I could get some published research out of that project. And the second was that it would provide monetary support for our graduate students, which was always in short supply. Um, so I was, if you ever examine my vita, that it's defined in turn by a number of these applied projects. I had money from the Department of Labor at the state of Michigan early on in my career, and there's a bunch of studies that came out of that. A lot of them on motivation and attitudes and job satisfaction. I also worked with Elaine Polakos at the FBI, and there's maybe a dozen papers that she and I and other colleagues published from that work. I also did work with the National Association of Secondary School Principals that Tom Jeswald got me into for more than a decade. And there's several, again, publications that came out of that work. John Rauschenberger helped me at Ford in a similar manner. John was an early graduate student at Michigan State. Mary Tenneper at AT&T, a contact I got through SIOP. And lastly, in my sort of last 10 or so years of my career, I got funding from the College Board. Again, was my main contact was Wayne Camara there.
Great. So do you have, you've kind of talked a little bit about this, but any sort of keys to success that you'd highlight
Oh,
people in the audience wondering, in the research domain at least?
well, I wouldn't underestimate luck. Luck at being in the right place at the right time and meeting the right people who happen to meet a project. The other thing I think is working hard. I did work hard, probably too hard. But I also think we ought to be, we talk a lot about programs of research. That wasn't emphasized as much when I was a new faculty member as it is now, I think. And I think programmatic research is important, but I think it should also be strategic and somewhat opportunistic. Strategic in the sense that you want to take on projects that can contribute to your underlying question or questions that you want to provide some information on, and opportunistic in the sense that you don't throw away a great opportunity for getting doing research that you might be interested in, even though it doesn't just fit a little niche in your program. There have been many situations in which that has occurred to me. I didn't mention some of my colleagues in the medical school at Michigan State asked me to do some work with them because they were interested in the decisions that women make during menopause with respect to estrogen replacement therapy. So we did probably 7 or 8 published pieces from that work over the years that had pretty much nothing to do with IO, but it did have something to do with my early interest in decision making. So it wasn't completely irrelevant, but time is short. I can't believe 40 years went by, and it's very short when you take into account that people are expected to get this fantastic record of research in 6 or 7 years for the tenure decision. So I think you can't plan a long longitudinal study and expect to, get many of those papers published in time for the tenure decision. So while you're interested in those topics and you should pursue them, I think you also need to think more short term, do small pieces that contribute to this big project that are potentially publishable in a short period of time. That's probably a long-winded answer.
No, that's a great answer. So let's move on to talk a little bit about your time as SIOP president. It was an atypical term, you told me.
Yes, I'm probably the only person who had only an 8-month term as president. It was the year that SIOP switched from having its conference at the APA convention to doing its own conference in April, and uh, having its whole administrative team switch in April instead of September. So that meant that my term, at least that year, was only from September to April. In our first time, the first time that we had the administrative, all the committees and everything switched in April as opposed to September. We also were concerned at that time by licensing. It's still, a concern for us. People have different views on the need for it and what should be involved. But at that time, it was a big issue. And I remember spending a fair amount of time at several different meetings discussing the ins and outs of how we should proceed with a stance on licensing. But other than that, it was, I think, a reasonably productive year. The switch over to an April to April administrative time seems to have gone well. I don't think very many people even remember that it was ever any different.
Probably the case. So we have, I want to also thank some of Neal's colleagues, past students who were kind enough to share with me a picture or two that maybe you'll see later, and then also some words about him. And so we have a couple of these, but these I sort of coded as Neal as an IO psychologist, and I'll give you the chance to read those, and the slides should also be available if I don't give you long enough. But Neal is the ideal all IO psychologists should strive to attain. And I'm sure, knowing things people have said about how humble Neal is, that he's not super comfortable with me showing all of these either right now.
That's true.
So,
They're embarrassingly a lot of, but I appreciate the thought.
So we'll move on. So I want to shift into talking a little bit about training graduate students. I know that was a really important part of your career from both what you've said and what your graduate students have said, and about your experience with the Michigan State PhD program in general. You spent a lot of time there, and so talk a little bit about that, about graduate training in IO, the program at Michigan State and your experience there, and maybe a little bit about advising and mentoring and how you attacked that.
This forehead, by the way, a bit of a comment. This was put together by some graduate students, I think, at Michigan State when Dan and I retired. And it shows our academic tree, but I think most interestingly is something you can't read. At the bottom of this column, these two columns, are the students that were officially our students. So they were very important parts of my career. I certainly think that I owe whatever success I've had to all of them. I do think that there are some things about doctoral training in IO psychology I feel fairly strong about. One is that whatever career objective the student has, they must be involved in research, and they must be involved in research from the time they enter our graduate program to the time they leave and beyond. Even if they go into a practitioner career, I think the approach to solving problems is important that we teach. Identify a problem, look for a solution, intervene, and then evaluate. And that particular approach to decision making does them well no matter where their career sends them. I think we, and this is true of our program, I think we do engage students very early in the research process. At least my students were always involved in a project from day one. And most of those projects ended up in some published product. And this got them to see the research process as it unfolded, as well as be engaged in the data analysis and writing of those papers. And then the student gradually took on their own projects and developed them as well as I could or any faculty member could. A thing that I always think was fairly representative of this approach was David Chan, who came from Singapore, not speaking English, or at least writing English very well. And I looked at this first writing product and thought, oh my God, I'm going to have to deal with this for 5 years. I didn't tell David that, but before he left, he was editing my papers and doing an excellent job. And as you know, he's written a lot of papers on his own. So I think, and MSU has always been, as an institution, an absolutely great place to work. We were provided with all the independence in the world to develop our own interests and activities. I think in the 40 some years I was there, I was never told what to do, never, by a chair, a dean, or anyone else. And that was really important to me. Advising and mentoring, I have commented on. I think close mentoring at the beginning and then gradually allowing for more independence. And the other thing, I have not published very much with alumni. And when I have, it's only been after several years after which they're out of Michigan State. A couple of exceptions with David Chan and Elaine Polakos, but even in those two instances, I think, and others as well, I didn't publish anything with them for 4 or 5 or more years after they got out of MSU. The idea being that they needed to establish their own credibility and their own credentials. All the silliness on tenure and promotion boards about having an independent identity may not be appropriate, but it exists. And so we sort of avoided that by not working together.
Well, on that subject, we have some quotes about Neal as a mentor here. Spend a little bit of time here.
I don't remember this dinner that they talk about in this last one at all. Where that was. Whoever wrote that, I'd like to know where we stopped.
I will get you all that information. So you'll have the source of all of these quotes after this. So I've titled the next slide, Neal as a Magician, which really is an unfair title because obviously it's Neal's work ethic and commitment and competence that make all these things possible. But it does seem near impossible to many of us, some of these quotes. And I may have a student or two watching. So if you're watching, don't pay any attention to that turnaround time information.
Well, the turnaround time is partly me, but it does have a history. I mentioned I was really in a hurry in graduate school because I'm always in a hurry, inappropriately so at times. But my major professor was not, and it took forever, it seemed to me, to get feedback on proposals and papers. And I swore if I was ever in that position, that would not be the case. And I am sure that it has not been. Some of these are exceptions, but I've always placed a high priority on responding to student papers and work.
And I will say that even for those exceptions, I heard them from probably 3 different people. So quite impressive. All right, now moving into our change over time portion. These pictures on the top row are from the year, approximately the year Neal got his PhD. And then we have present pictures. And so Neal, I'm curious about a couple of things that have changed throughout your career. My first question is, what is something that you've changed your mind about over time?
Probably one, and that is, I used to be of the opinion that students ought to get out as fast as they could. And I still think that's important because they learn a lot more after they leave graduate school than they do during graduate school, I think. But I would never advise them to try to get out in 3 and maybe not even 4 years now. There's just too much that they can get from a graduate school experience that they would not need to be out in the shorter period of time. I think I've also changed my mind a little bit about well, I was going to say about the content of the research. I think we've expanded our field fairly significantly in the last several years. There's all kinds of work on teams and macro issues that simply did not appear for the first maybe couple decades of my career. There's also an emphasis on diversity and inclusion that I was blind to for most of my career, and it's now coming to the fore in much of our programs and our research. So that's not really something I've changed my mind about. It's a change, though, that I think that's important for the field.
Great.
I also think we've lost some of our emphasis, and this may not be positive, emphasis on the availability of measurement and quantitative analysis and expertise. It was always easy to do away with a quant person in a program. They didn't have substantive interests, and the rest of our departments often felt that they weren't making a significant contribution. So we did away with them. And now it's, I think, a problem for many programs. Those change pictures actually amused me. Go back a little bit further. I grew up with a crank phone on a wall and a party line that had 20 people on it or so. And so we communicated whose call it was by the number of rings that it made. And we didn't have TVs in my house when I was a kid. And those pickup trucks were really a tractor and a wagon. But there's one academic thing that also has changed radically, and that is when I first started, we put our data and our programmatic codes on cards. We key punch them into cards. Well, today's students, if you talk about a card, they have a blank look on their face. And this made research very much slower. So we'd key punch our cards, go read them into a card reader in the computer center, wait for a turnaround. And if we made one mistake, we could start the whole process over again. So nowadays you can sit at your computer, and if you make an error, you can change it in 10 or 15 seconds and get a second run. That's just a radical change. Along with that change, though, the demands on what constitutes a published article today are much, much more significant than they were when I started. So we have 3, 4, 5 study papers in our journal. We have journals that are articles that are 20, 30 pages long. That's a lot of work.
Okay, we're we're going to wrap up here in a couple of minutes so we can take some questions, but I'm going to move through some pictures, and you can choose to tell us a little bit about them if you'd like.
Well, the first one on the left is my wife and my daughter. For a number of years, we made an annual trip to Colorado to go skiing. In the right picture on the right, we're standing on a grooming machine. I forget what they call those. We've gone skiing just about every winter. I went again this last winter, but I realized I'm not very good at it. And not only that, when I fall down, I don't get hurt, but I can't get up without taking my skis off. It is just not working. So I'm not sure how much more I'll do of skiing, but we spent a lot of great winters in Colorado.
I love this picture. I don't know what's going on here, but.
Well, we lived on 10 acres in Michigan, and there were a lot of woods on it. So cleaning up brush and woods and so on, and then burning them after a while was the way I worked with it. But Cara always thought I was a latent arsonist because she was convinced I was going to burn down the place. Here, I'm burning up the remnants of my daughter's tree house, which no longer functioned when she left. So it was done carefully in green trees, and we didn't burn anything that wasn't supposed to be burnt.
Good to hear. All right, how about this one?
This is a Halloween party. For a number of years, Ken Wexley and Kevin Ford and others had Halloween parties that we got into costume. You can see myself and Cara as Mickey and Minnie Mouse there. You can also see Steve Kozlowski, the white face. A couple other people that you may know. Mickey Cunon is the second from the left. And Ron Landis is next to my wife. And I think Sherry Ostroff is next to Steve Kozlowski. So, retirement, we've always tried to travel. This is one of the great advantages of an academic career. These happen to depict us in Arizona and in the Tetons, but and those were not work trips, but almost every trip I took for maybe 25 years was associated with a conference or some kind of work. But it took us to China and Japan and Korea, Thailand, and Russia, and Chile, and many, many more countries. So that this was important, both for myself and for Cara, and also Krista, as it worked out.
All right, we have one last slide. Neal as a person. I'll leave this up for a little bit, and then I'll give Neal a chance to say any final words that he has for us, and then we'll move into the question and answer period.
I just want to say that it was a great, great career, and still continuing. I still do some projects. But again, as I began, I want to thank all the people who contributed to that career. There are way too many to even mention, but it certainly includes the faculty and graduate students, colleagues at SIOP, and so on that have helped me over the last 45 years.
All right. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Lauren, who's going to facilitate the question and answer period. And we'll do this until the end of the session. We'll note when the session is over, but if you'd like to stay along a while longer, the room will be open longer. So you're welcome to go when you need to, but you're welcome to stay if you'd like.
Feel free to raise your hand if you have a question, want to unmute and ask. Or you put it in the chat. Or raise your hand like this. I'll go ahead and unmute you.
Well, that's an easy question and it's short. The answer is short. I'm most proud of the students that we graduated during the time I was at Michigan State. Not just mine, but all of the students who came out of our program.
This is Rich. Sorry. Neal, I've known you for many, many years as a colleague and a friend, but I think the biography didn't do enough to comment on your servant leadership. A department chair, acting dean. I mean, you've given in other ways. I wonder if you just talk a moment about any of those, if you can. Oh, he left.
I just deadened the phone. So
yeah. And how long were you department chair? I don't remember.
I was department chair for 10 years, and I retired from, well, officially as a department chair in 2010. I then did a couple of other projects. We tried to utilize some biographical data and situational judgment measures for undergraduate selection. That worked for a while, but then the person that was our champion left the university and it was not continued. Then I did serve as the interim dean of the College of Social Science for a year. And then my official title, if you look at the MSU page now, is associate provost of some sort. I was I was an official advisor to a chair of strategy and policy in the business school, was taking over an especially problematic department in which the faculty members were warring with each other. I don't know if I ever helped them much, but that's what it was for.
Yeah, Neal, I do remember, I'll leave you with this. You said at one time, being a dean is a lot easier than being a full professor.
No, it was easier than being a department chair.
Oh, department chair, okay, there you go.
In the sense that I had a lot more support and I was distant from the action, so to speak. And the support was the main thing. As a department chair, you just get to do everything, or at least at Michigan State we did, with everyone. And as a dean, I usually could delegate things much more efficiently.
Thanks.
I'm unmuted now, so I'll speak. Hi, Neal. It's been great to hear your thoughts today, and all the data that have come in today is not surprisingly, but refreshingly consistent with my wonderful experiences in working with you. I'll offer two questions. You can answer one. So one is more serious, and I know you've thought about how the role of psychometrics in the era of big data and how we might think about that moving forward, which has been a personal interest of mine. So I'd be interested in any further thoughts. The second question is more about any reflections on the struggles with animals invading your garden. I always enjoyed hearing about those during lunches we've had. It kind of cracked me up. How serious you would get about that, and maybe you have some thoughts about that still that plague you.
Well, the animals haven't left me. We live in a suburb now, but in back of us is the Reading Town Forest, which is a conservation area, and rabbits and woodchucks and deer eat everything I plant, and so I haven't gotten away. But at Michigan State, we had 10 acres. I had a large garden, and woodchucks and possums almost always ate at least half of whatever I grew. And I had a running battle trying to trap them and poison them and transport them to other places, and never, ever won anything. The other question you had more seriously, I think the challenge of big data is that we almost have to be interdisciplinary in ways that we never envisioned, I don't think, because our data comes from many different places. The other thing is we get data often from sources that don't have the same issues about data quality as we do, data reliability and accuracy. So the quality of the data is suspicious from the time that it's generated, not just when we use it. And I think that we also are required, at least I would be required if I were doing big data studies, to educate myself on on the data analytic techniques involved. They're not simple, and they require a level of expertise that at least I didn't have. And I think most of my contemporaries, and even your contemporaries perhaps, did not have. Thanks to you, you've actually educated yourself.
Somewhat. No, thank you. And thanks for sharing your frustration with the animals. I think people here got a taste of what I don't mean to laugh too much, Neal. I sympathize with you as well, but that was a real struggle in your hobby or in your.
One of the funnier stories was I usually took these animals I captured and delivered them, gave them a new address. And one day Krista was with me in the car when we took these animals out, and I left them off in the ditch somewhere. And she says, "How come you took such a circuitous route to get here?" And I didn't think it was, but she did. I says, "Well, I'm going to mix the animals up so they won't know how to get back." And I thought she thought I was kidding. But 20 years later, the people in her wedding party asked me about how I confused these animals. All these years, Krista believed me. So I found that worth all the trouble with the animals.
Hi, Neal, it's Milt, and I have a question for you about the National Association of Secondary School Principals, and what stands out for you from that series of research, beside the difficulty of working with school principals?
Actually, they were not hard to work with. I had Tom Jeswold introduced me to Paul Hersey at NESSP. He didn't know anything about research, but he listened to everything I did and he gave me complete support. And we went all over the country interviewing people and collecting data. And it was a marvelous organization to work with. The school administrators were unbelievable people. They're under complete, real significant pressure from multiple constituencies. The students themselves, the parents, the community, lawmakers in some cases. So it was a good project. It was, and they always tolerated me taking along students. And I think the students found it interesting work. So I didn't find that situation frustrating at all. It also represents, I think, what I mentioned earlier, and that's the importance of a champion in the organization that you're working with that knows a little bit about psychology and what you're trying to do. If you don't have someone like that, the projects often end when somebody doesn't agree with what you're doing, or they come up with a crazy idea about how it should be done, and you have to waste your time satisfying their issues. So that project was not frustrating, I don't think.
Neal, this is Wayne.
Mhm.
Neal, just a couple of comments. One is the name of the grooming machine at the ski area is called a snowcat.
Hmm.
Probably remember that. But I also want to point out that, the applied projects that you mentioned are so valuable. But SIOP has been a phenomenal organization for bringing colleagues together. And I think back so fondly of the validation research that you and I and Paul Sackett did for the National Security Agency back in, I think it was 1989 or 1990. And your comment there about having a champion at the organization who understood a little bit about psychometrics and about IO psychology was invaluable, I think, for all of us as we were working there, because we had a couple of champions at NSA who were working with us. But I just wanted to thank you for the impact you had on me as well. I think an enormous amount from each other. And that all happened because we got to know each other through SIOP.
Well, I just thought about the National Association of Secondary School Principals project was actually a SIOP project initially. SIOP, Joel Moses and Tom Jeswald developed the assessment center that we worked on evaluating and developing over a number of years. So that was a SIOP connection to begin with as well. And of course, I met Mary Tenneper at SIOP, and we did a variety of work for and with her over a number of years. And I'm sure there are others that I've forgotten. But yes, I did note, didn't say today, one of the things that new professionals should definitely do is to get engaged with SIOP as soon as possible. Don't let it overwhelm you, but definitely get started. Thank you, Wayne.
There was a question in the chat. What are the most important competencies, qualities, and/or values an IO psychology grad student should nurture or have, in your opinion?
Ooh. That's not an easy one. I think the integrity is certainly important. Probably the most important. You may be able to get by in some projects, but not long-term if you don't have a good sense of ethics and what's appropriate to do and not to do. Beyond that, I think you have to be able to, I mentioned earlier, solve problems. It's content free, I think. You have to be able to recognize a problem when it exists, problem identification, and then look for solutions, develop interventions, and evaluate. Those sorts of things are critical, I think, as an industrial organizational psychologist in whatever context they work.
Another one popped up in the chat. Is there a book or two you've given most as a gift or recommended to people?
Ooh. Well, that's a good question. I know I spent a lot of time with Vic Vroom's book on motivation when I was a new professor many, many decades ago. I also used Bloom and Naylor's IO textbook a lot. In the quantitative area, I certainly used Nunnally many, many times, and Weiner. These are now old books, but books similar to that are perhaps the ones that I found most useful. But as to one book, I'm not sure I'd be able to identify one.
I just want to say, I don't have a question, but I've heard many of Neal's stories before, so I'm not looking for another story, but I just wanted to acknowledge what a fantastic environment Neal helped to craft as senior faculty. When I was starting my career at Michigan State University, it gave us a lot of freedom and a lot of good advice when we needed it. And I know I benefited enormously from being in that program at that time.
That went both ways.
Yeah, well, and you mentioned this earlier. We had extraordinary independence. So I always described myself as being an intrapreneur because you had to find money or resources or what have you, but you could do that. And we were not really directed. We had a lot of autonomy in how we ran the program and crafted it, right? There were always some rules, but we had extraordinary autonomy. And quite frankly, that's tended to evaporate at most universities. And certainly I felt that that was happening at Michigan State. But when we had it, it was fantastic. And I would say I benefited so much from the kind of, senior faculty play an important role in crafting the climate of whatever program you're in. And Dan and Neal did a fantastic job. It was great to grow up there.
Thank you, Steve. I'm
Absolutely. Have most of my career there. It's fantastic.
sorry to hear that you've heard all these stories often.
Well, I do remember the groundhog. I thought was the real nemesis. It was always the groundhog.
Yes, it was.
Great to see you this way, Neal.
Thank you.
Neal, you have somewhat of a reputation as an absent-minded professor. I wonder if there's one of the stories you would like to share with us.
Oh yeah, like we can generate lots of those.
Do you have a favorite one or one that I should tip you off on? What do you think?
Well, there's several, and most of them have been embellished by Kyle. But one I remember, Ken Wexley and I were going to a conference. It's actually a SIOP sponsored conference in North Carolina. And so we went to the airport together, and we were a little early, so we sat down at the cafe for a cup of coffee. And Ken looks up and he says, "Neal, is that our plane?" It was going down the runway. And we had talked right through the departure. And, Ken proceeded to alternate between, virtually crying that we'd missed our flight, what we were going to do, and then laughing hilariously at the fact that we forgot to get up and go get our plane.
In the version of that story that I actually heard from someone, I heard that the pilots had been actually sitting in front of you.
They might have been. I don't know.
Yes, I've heard that version myself.
Well, the other one that's like that is we went to the airport once on our way to Colorado, and this was in the days when security was more relaxed than it is now. So I parked the car in front of the airport. Lansing's a little bitty airport, so you can just drive right up to the gate practically, and took the luggage out and into the airport and checked it, and proceeded to get on the plane and leave with my car out in front of the airport. And got to Colorado, and we were doing something out there. I says, "Car, do you know where I parked my car?" And she says, "No, I wasn't there." I says, "I think it's still parked in front of the airport." It wasn't in front of the airport anymore. It had been towed away. But I suffered for that one.
I heard you also once got on the wrong plane.
Yes, that's the classic story.
Well, we were in Pittsburgh. I was in Pittsburgh coming back from somewhere and getting a connecting flight to Lansing. And I was reading something, doing some work, and the gate person made an announcement, and everybody around me got up and left. So I left with them and got on the plane. And we were taxiing down the runway, and the waiter got on the intercom and said, "Is there anyone on this plane who plans to go to Lansing, Michigan?" And for just an instant, I thought, God, I hope there's more than one. And there wasn't. So I convinced them I had to get off because I had a meeting the next day in Grand Rapids, next morning at 8 o'clock. And so they taxied back to the airport runway and left me out the back of the plane. They didn't go up to the to the runway. So I was in the front and I had to face all these people who were anxious to get home as I walked out the back of the plane. But then couldn't get a flight to anywhere in Michigan that night. So I rented a car and drove back from Pittsburgh, which is about 300 miles from Lansing. And I really got back just before I had to leave for Grand Rapids for my meeting. It was not a good evening. Well, thank you all for coming and listening. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, Neal, it was great hearing these comments and look forward to interacting with you. Hope to see you sooner than later and certainly at the next SIOP meeting.
Mhm. Yes, I hope SIOP returns to normal.
Yeah, then we could be doing this with a couple of scotches or something.
Yeah, this was okay, but I don't like it.
I think we're all in on that.
Well, I think it was incredibly adaptive for Georgia and the rest of the SIOP leadership to do this, though. Sounds like
Yeah,
it's
the
kept organized.
folks I really need to take the credit for this, and they've done a fantastic job. I mean, really, if you think of, last year it was just a mad scramble, and Hoover, as wonderful as it is, has certain limitations. And this year they were prepared, and they put together a great virtual, interactive. So it's really amazing how well they've adapted to the space. Maybe we'll have a hybrid going forward, but I can't wait to have an actual SIOP where I can see people.
Mhm.
Well, and we had over 3,000 people registered for the conference this time. So that's wonderful. It really is Whitney Boxford Morgan and Emily Solberg who made both incredible work. Thank you, Neal.
Thank you, Georgia.
I saw a lot of former MSU grad students who were in attendance, so that's cool as well. Take care, Neal. Say hi to Cara.
Yes, sir.
Bye, Neal.
Goodbye, Rich. Goodbye, everyone.